For most of human history, the human body lay down to rest without lifting the head away from the ground. The neck did not seek softness, and the spine did not expect support. What feels natural to us now was once absent for nearly all who lived before. Across thousands of generations, sleep happened closer to the earth, shaped more by terrain, temperature, and necessity than by comfort. If something so ordinary today did not exist for so long, it quietly suggests that the body we carry may not have been formed around the habits we now depend on. And if that is true, then what exactly changed? And what did we slowly leave behind when we raised our heads off the ground? Why did 90% of human history never use a pillow? Long before crafted surfaces and controlled environments, the human body came to rest directly upon the ground, not as a decision guided by comfort, but as a continuation of movement that gradually slowed and then settled into stillness. The earth was not something separate from sleep, but part of the same continuous experience. Soil, grass, packed dirt, stone, or layers of fallen leaves formed the surface where the body lay, and each of these carried its own texture, its own firmness, and its own temperature. None of them were designed to receive the body, and yet the body learned to rest upon them without expectation that they should change. Instead, the human form adjusted itself in quiet and subtle ways, redistributing weight, shifting pressure points, and allowing muscles to release tension once a stable position was found. The head, which in modern life is often raised and supported, moved toward the same surface as the rest of the body, lowering until it met the ground without separation. This was not a rare or uncomfortable condition. It was a repeated pattern, shared across many environments and sustained through countless generations who did not encounter an alternative way of sleeping. In landscapes that varied from open plains to forested areas, the surface beneath the body could be uneven, gently influencing how a person arranged themselves before sleep. A slight slope, a cluster of roots, or a patch of softer material could guide the final position of the head, but these were not objects created for support. They were simply features of the environment, and the body responded to them rather than transforming them into tools. Because of this, the boundary between the human body and the earth remained minimal. There was little physical distance between where a person lived and where they rested, and no clear division between the environment and the act of sleep. Lying down did not require preparation in the way it often does now. There was no need to arrange bedding, to adjust layers, or to place an object beneath the head to achieve a specific posture. The transition into rest was direct, shaped by immediate conditions and by the body's ability to adapt to them. When viewed across the long span of early human existence, this pattern appears not as a limitation, but as the foundation from which all later sleeping habits emerged. Even when simple materials such as animal skins, grasses, or leaves were gathered and placed beneath the body, they did not function as separate structures designed to elevate or isolate the head. They remained part of the same surface, softening contact but not altering the overall relationship between the body and the ground. The neck continued to align naturally with the spine, without the introduction of an external support that would change its angle. In this way, sleep remained closely connected to the natural form of the human body and the physical realities of the environment. There was no expectation of comfort, as it is understood today, only the need for stability, safety, and the ability to remain at rest for extended periods. Over time, this repeated interaction between body and ground formed a consistent pattern, one that did not rely on added objects or constructed surfaces. The earth, in all its variations, served as the first and most constant place of rest, shaping how humans slept long before the idea of lifting the head above the ground became part of everyday life. As the body lowered itself toward the ground night after night, a quiet pattern began to repeat, not through instruction but through simple physical response. The shape of the land, the firmness beneath, and the weight of the body created a set of conditions that did not change quickly, and so the body did not need to search for new solutions each time it came to rest. Instead, it relied on small adjustments that could be made almost without awareness, subtle shifts that distributed pressure across the shoulders, back, and hips until a stable position emerged. The shoulders would settle first, then the back, and finally the head would follow, finding a point of contact that allowed the neck to remain neither strained nor fully unsupported. In the absence of a separate object placed beneath the head, the position of the neck depended entirely on how the rest of the body aligned itself with the surface. This meant that sleep began not at the head, but across the entire form, as a distributed balance rather than a single point of support. When the ground was firm, the body often adjusted by slightly bending the limbs or turning to one side, creating a natural curve that reduced pressure along the spine. When the surface was softer, such as a layer of leaves or grass, the body sank just enough to create a shallow impression, and within that impression, the head found its place without needing elevation. These interactions were shaped by gravity and by the physical limits of joints and muscles, not by an intention to create comfort in the modern sense. Across long stretches of time, repeated contact with the ground may have encouraged flexibility in posture rather than reliance on a fixed sleeping position. The body could shift during the night, rolling or turning in response to pressure, temperature, or subtle discomfort, and each new position would again rely on the same principle. The ground remains constant and the body adapts. This continuous adjustment did not interrupt rest, but instead allowed it to be maintained, as small movements prevented strain from building in one place for too long. In this way, the absence of a pillow did not leave the head unsupported, but instead required the entire body to participate in maintaining alignment. Stability came not from elevation, but from distribution, from the way different parts of the body shared contact with the surface beneath them. Looking back toward early human environments, where materials were not shaped into precise forms and where surfaces were rarely uniform, this kind of adaptive positioning would have been not only common, but necessary. The ground could be cold, uneven, or textured in ways that required constant adjustment, and so sleep itself became a process that allowed for movement within stillness. Even when additional materials were present, such as animal hides or gathered plant matter, they did not function as structured supports for the head. They remained flexible and uneven, conforming to the ground rather than replacing it, and so the body continued to rely on its own structure to find rest. This suggests that the experience of lying flat, with the head close to the same level as the torso, was not an exception but a repeated condition across much of human history. It also suggests that what is now considered a necessary element of sleep, the lifting of the head onto a distinct object, may not have been required for the body to reach a state of rest. Instead, rest emerged from a balance between gravity, surface, and form, a balance that did not depend on added support, but on the body's ability to respond to the ground beneath it in a consistent and sustainable way over time, shaped by conditions that remained relatively stable across generations, long before crafted objects became part of the sleeping environment and changed the way the head was positioned during the night. Over time, the repeated act of resting on the ground did not simply remain a passive habit, but became part of a deeper relationship between the human body and the environment in which it existed. The surface beneath was never perfectly still or identical from one place to another, yet it remained consistent enough that the body did not require new tools to manage it. Instead, it learned to recognize patterns in texture, firmness, and temperature, responding with small positional changes that allowed rest to continue without interruption. The head, in particular, did not occupy a privileged position within this process. It followed the same logic as the rest of the body, finding its place through alignment rather than elevation. When the body lay on its side, the angle of the shoulder created a natural space for the head to settle, reducing the need for anything additional. When lying on the back, the slight curvature of the upper spine allowed the head to rest without sharp extension. These positions were not designed in advance, but emerge from the physical structure of the body interacting with gravity and the ground. Across long stretches of early human existence, where environments shifted slowly and materials remained largely unmodified, this pattern repeated itself with little variation. There was no clear moment when the absence of a pillow would have been noticed, because there was no reference for comparison. Sleep occurred within the limits of what was available, and those limits were stable enough that the body adapted to them rather than resisting them. In cooler conditions, the ground could draw heat away from the body, and this influenced how closely different parts of the body were held together. The head, remaining close to the surface, participated in this exchange of heat, just as the rest of the body did. In warmer conditions, the contact with the ground could provide a subtle form of cooling, again shaping how the body arranged itself. These environmental factors did not act on the head alone, but on the entire form, reinforcing the idea that sleep was a whole-body adjustment rather than a localized problem to be solved with a single object. Archaeological findings, while limited in their ability to capture the full experience of sleep, suggest that early resting places were simple and closely tied to the surrounding environment. Layers of plant material, traces of repeated use in certain areas, and the absence of shaped head supports all point toward a mode of rest that remained integrated with the ground rather than separated from it. Even in later periods, when more structured living spaces began to appear, the transition toward elevating the head did not happen immediately or uniformly. It emerged gradually, influenced by changes in materials, social structures, and built environments. This slow emergence indicates that for a very long time, the human body did not rely on a raised support for the head in order to rest. Instead, it continued to operate within a system where stability came from alignment and adaptation. The ground provided a constant reference point, and the body responded by adjusting itself within that frame, night after night. When viewed from this perspective, the idea of a pillow appears not as an essential requirement for sleep, but as a later addition that altered an already stable relationship. The earlier pattern, repeated across generations and environments, suggests that the absence of such an object did not prevent rest, but shaped it in a different way, one that remained closely connected to the physical realities of the natural world and to the long history of human adaptation within it. Before any object was placed beneath the head, the human body already carried within it the basic structures required to lie down and rest. The neck was not built around softness, and the spine did not emerge in an environment filled with cushions, raised beds, or shaped supports. It developed within a world where the body met the ground more directly, and where rest depended less on comfort than on position, balance, and the ability to release muscular effort without losing stability. The human spine is not a straight column, but a series of gentle curves that help distribute weight and absorb force during standing, walking, and lying down. These curves do not disappear at night. They remain part of the body's form, and when the body lowers itself to a surface, they influence how pressure is shared across the back, shoulders, hips, and head. In a setting without pillows, this means the head does not need to be treated as a separate engineering problem. Its resting place is shaped by the alignment of the whole body. If the shoulders are slightly forward, the neck responds. If the torso rotates, the head follows. If the knees bend, the lower back changes position, and this affects the upper spine as well. What appears simple from the outside is actually a chain of connected adjustments, each one small, each one helping the body settle into a posture that can be sustained. This matters when thinking about most of human history, because for thousands of generations, sleep happened before the widespread creation of objects designed to support the head alone. Early humans did not need to invent a pillow before they could sleep. They relied on anatomy that was already flexible enough to accommodate uneven ground, varying surfaces, and repeated changes in posture during the night. The muscles of the neck, the shape of the shoulders, and the mobility of the spine all worked together within a body that was used not only for rest, but for carrying, climbing, walking long distances, and maintaining balance on irregular terrain. A body shaped by such conditions would not necessarily expect the head to be lifted every time it lay down. In many cases, a slight turn to the side, a bend at the arm, or a shift in shoulder position would create enough space for the head to rest without sharp strain. This does not mean every surface was easy, or that every night was equally restful. It means the body itself was the first system of support. Even today, when people lie down without a pillow, they often respond not by becoming unable to rest, but by adjusting the rest of the body until the neck feels more stable. That impulse may reflect something very old, the tendency to solve discomfort through posture before solving it through objects. Looking back toward early human origins, this becomes especially important. The body that first moved across open ground, sheltered in simple places, and slept close to the earth did not begin with specialized sleep equipment. It began with bones, muscles, joints, and soft tissue capable of adapting to pressure and position. Over long periods of time, this biological flexibility would have mattered more than the absence of any one object. In that sense, the history of sleeping without a pillow is also the history of a body that could tolerate a broader range of resting conditions than many modern environments seem to assume. The question is not whether early humans lacked comfort as modern people define it, but whether the body itself once played a much larger role in creating the conditions for rest. long before comfort became something added from the outside. When the body is considered not as a fixed structure but as a system that constantly adjusts to its surroundings, the absence of a pillow begins to appear less unusual. The neck, often imagined as needing support from below, is in fact part of a continuous chain that connects the head to the shoulders, the upper spine, and the rest of the body. Its position during rest is not determined in isolation, but shaped by how the entire body settles into the surface beneath it. In early human environments, where the ground varied from firm to uneven and where no standardized sleeping surfaces existed, this interconnected system allowed for a wide range of resting positions that did not rely on a single external support. The muscles surrounding the neck and shoulders are capable of maintaining subtle levels of tension even during rest, preventing the head from collapsing into positions that would cause sharp discomfort. At the same time, these muscles can gradually release as the body finds a stable alignment, allowing the head to remain supported through the structure of the body itself, rather than through an added object. This process does not happen instantly. It unfolds over minutes, sometimes longer, as the body makes small corrections, adjusting angles and redistributing weight until a sustainable position is reached. In this way, rest emerges from adaptation rather than from prearranged comfort. Across much of human history, this kind of adaptation would have been necessary, because the surfaces available for sleep were not consistent. A patch of ground might be slightly sloped or interrupted by small irregularities, requiring the body to respond each time it lay down. The neck, instead of being lifted to meet an expected level, would follow the contour created by the shoulders and upper torso. When lying on the side, the width of the shoulder naturally creates a gap between the head and the ground, but this gap does not always require filling. The head can tilt slightly, the arm can be repositioned, or the torso can rotate just enough to reduce strain. When lying on the back, the gentle curve of the spine allows the head to rest with a slight backward tilt, often without discomfort if the rest of the body is properly aligned. These positions are not fixed rules but flexible responses that depend on the surface and on the condition of the body at that moment. Over time, repeated exposure to such conditions may have encouraged a tolerance for variation in sleeping posture. Instead of expecting a single ideal position, the body remained capable of shifting throughout the night, redistributing pressure and preventing any one area from becoming overstressed. This capacity for movement during rest suggests that sleep in earlier environments may have been less about maintaining a perfect posture and more about maintaining a dynamic balance. The absence of a pillow did not remove support from the neck, it changed where that support came from. Rather than being concentrated in one place beneath the head, support was spread across multiple contact points between the body and the ground. The shoulders, upper back, and even the position of the arms all contributed to how the head was held. In colder environments, the body might curl slightly, bringing the head closer to the chest and reducing exposure. In warmer conditions, the body might extend more fully, allowing heat to dissipate. In both cases, the position of the head followed the overall configuration of the body, not an external object. This pattern can still be observed in situations where people rest without modern bedding, whether temporarily or by necessity. The body does not lose its ability to adapt. It simply relies more heavily on internal adjustments rather than external supports. Looking back to early human origins, where survival depended on flexibility and responsiveness to the environment, this capacity would have been essential. The neck and spine did not evolve in isolation from these conditions. They developed as part of a body that needed to function across a wide range of activities and terrains, and sleep was one of many states in which that adaptability was expressed. From this perspective, the later introduction of pillows can be seen not as a solution to a biological deficiency, but as a modification of an already functional system. It changes the distribution of support, concentrates it beneath the head, and reduces the need for the rest of the body to adjust as much. But before that shift, the body itself carried the responsibility for maintaining alignment during rest, using the same structures that supported movement during the day. As the body continued to rely on its own structure during rest, the relationship between the neck and the rest of the spine became part of a broader pattern that did not require separation or isolation. The head did not need to be lifted away from the body to achieve stability, because stability was already emerging from alignment across multiple connected segments. The upper spine, the shoulders, and the base of the skull formed a continuous system, one that responded to gravity by distributing force rather than concentrating it in a single point. When lying down without a pillow, this system did not collapse. It adjusted, often in ways that were subtle and gradual, until a position could be maintained without constant muscular effort. The neck, instead of being held up by an external support, rested within the range allowed by the joints and soft tissues that connected it to the torso. This range was not fixed but flexible, allowing for small variations depending on the surface and the posture chosen. In early human environments, where the ground was rarely uniform and where each resting place presented slightly different conditions, this flexibility would have been essential. A surface that was slightly inclined might lead the body to rotate, bringing the head into a different angle relative to the spine. A firmer surface might encourage a different distribution of weight than a softer one. In each case, the neck did not require a precise external correction. It adapted through its connection to the rest of the body. This suggests that the experience of sleeping without a pillow was not defined by a lack of support, but by a different kind of support, one that emerged from the internal coordination of the body rather than from an added object. Over long periods of time, repeated exposure to these conditions may have reinforced patterns of movement and rest that were less dependent on fixed positions. The body could settle, shift, and resettle, maintaining comfort not through stillness alone, but through the ability to adjust before discomfort became too great. This capacity to move within rest reflects a system that does not rely on a single ideal alignment, but on a range of acceptable ones. When the head is raised onto a pillow, the range of positions may become more limited, because the pillow defines a specific height and angle. Without it, the body retains more freedom to explore slight variations in posture, guided by sensation and by the need to maintain balance across different points of contact. Looking back toward the early phases of human history, where sleeping environments were shaped by natural conditions rather than constructed ones, this kind of flexibility would have aligned with the broader demands placed on the body. The same structures that allowed for walking over uneven terrain, for carrying weight, and for maintaining balance during movement would also support the body during rest. Sleep, in this sense, was not a separate domain with its own specialized requirements, but an extension of the same physical system operating under different conditions. Even as materials such as plant fibers or animal skins were occasionally used to modify the surface, they did not fundamentally change this relationship. They softened contact but did not redefine alignment. The head remained part of the whole, not an isolated element requiring its own support system. This long continuity suggests that for much of human history, the body did not depend on the elevation of the head to achieve rest. Instead, it relied on an integrated structure capable of distributing pressure, adjusting to variation, and maintaining stability through connection rather than separation. From this perspective, the absence of a pillow is not simply an absence of an object, but a reflection of a different way in which the body and the environment once worked together to create the conditions for sleep. For most of human history, what lay beneath the human body at night was not a pillow, and often not even what a modern person would call a bed, but a surface gathered from whatever the environment could provide. The difference matters because a surface is not the same thing as a support designed for one part of the body. A layer of grass, a scatter of leaves, an animal hide, a woven mat, or a patch of smoothed earth could soften contact with the ground, reduce moisture, or provide a little insulation. But these materials did not usually lift the head into a separate position. They changed the feel of the ground without changing its basic role. The body still rested on a shared plane, and the head remained part of that overall arrangement. This helps explain why the absence of pillows across such a long span of time was not simply a matter of lacking softness. Humans were often capable of creating softer surfaces long before they created specialized support for the head. What they had, in many cases, was not nothing, but something more general, material placed beneath the body as a whole rather than beneath the head alone. In early human settings, this would have depended heavily on place. In wooded environments, leaves and grasses might be gathered more easily. In colder regions, animal skins may have helped reduce heat loss from direct contact with the ground. In drier or more open landscapes, people may have rested on bare earth, on simple plant layers, or on surfaces shaped only slightly by repeated use. None of these can be treated as universal, because human groups lived in many climates across very long periods of time. But what remains consistent is that these materials functioned mainly as surfaces, not as shaped objects meant to hold the neck at a chosen angle. They responded to the body by compressing, shifting, and flattening. They were flexible, broad, and shared. In that sense, they behaved more like an extension of the ground than like a separate sleeping device. This distinction becomes even clearer when we consider what a pillow actually does in modern life. A pillow separates the head from the surface below, introduces a distinct height difference, and often creates an expectation that the neck should be maintained in a specific relationship to the torso. A layer of leaves or fur does not usually do that. It cushions contact, but it rarely defines posture with precision. The head may sink slightly, just as the shoulders and hips do, but it is not singled out for special treatment. That tells us something important about the older logic of sleep. For a very long time, the human body did not approach rest by first solving the problem of head support. It approached rest by finding a usable surface overall. The whole body came down together, and any comfort that emerged did so through shared contact, rather than specialized elevation. Looking back toward the earliest periods of human existence, close to the beginning of our species and before permanent built interiors became common, this broader approach makes sense. Sleep had to fit inside a world of limited materials, variable weather, and repeated movement. A surface that was portable, available, or easy to gather mattered more than one that offered precision. Even later, as more settled ways of life slowly appeared in some places, the transition from general surfaces to specialized objects was gradual rather than immediate. That slowness suggests that the body could rest for a very long time without demanding a distinct object beneath the head. It also suggests that when we imagine the deep human past, we should not picture a total absence of material between body and earth, but rather a world in which softness existed without specialization, and where the surface of sleep remained broad, simple, and close to the ground. When a surface is shared by the entire body, its properties' influence rest in a different way than a small, specialized object ever could. A wide layer of grass, leaves, or hides does not direct the body toward a single posture. Instead, it offers a broad field of contact where weight can be spread and adjusted gradually. This changes how pressure is experienced. Rather than being concentrated under a few points, it is distributed across larger areas, allowing the body to settle into the surface with less need for correction. The head, in this context, is not singled out for support, but becomes one of many contact points interacting with the same material. If the surface compresses, it compresses under the head just as it does under the shoulders and hips. If it shifts in response to the entire body, not to one isolated part. This shared response creates a kind of continuity, where the position of the head is shaped by the position of everything around it. In early human environments, this continuity would have been reinforced by the nature of available materials. Plant matter, for example, is rarely uniform. Leaves overlap in irregular layers, grasses bend and flatten, and even animal skins, when placed on uneven ground, follow the contours beneath them. As a result, the surface remains dynamic, subtly changing shape as the body moves or settles. The head, resting within this changing field, does not remain fixed at a single angle. It adjusts along with the rest of the body, finding positions that reduce tension rather than maintaining a predetermined alignment. This kind of adjustment may appear minor, but over the course of a night, it allows the body to avoid prolonged stress in any one area. Small shifts can relieve pressure, redistribute weight, and maintain circulation, all without requiring the head to be lifted or held in place by an external support. From a long historical perspective, this suggests that sleep was not built around maintaining a precise posture, but around allowing a range of acceptable ones. The surface did not enforce a single way of lying down. It permitted variation, and the body responded accordingly. This becomes especially relevant when considering how different environments might shape different resting patterns. In a cooler region, a thicker layer of plant material or hides might create a softer surface that allows deeper compression. In a warmer or drier region, a thinner layer might result in firmer contact, leading the body to adjust more actively through posture. In both cases, the head remains part of the same system, not an exception to it. Archaeological observations, where available, support the idea that early sleeping areas were defined more by repeated use than by constructed form. Certain spots show signs of accumulated plant material or smoothing, suggesting that people return to the same places over time, gradually shaping the surface through use rather than design. Yet even in these cases, there is little indication of objects specifically created to raise the head. The pattern remains consistent, the entire body meets a prepared surface, but the head is not isolated as a separate problem to be solved. This continuity helps explain why the concept of a pillow, as a distinct and intentional support for the head, appears relatively late in human history and does not emerge uniformly across all cultures at the same time. Before that shift, rest was achieved through a relationship between body and surface that remained broad and integrated. The surface did not need to be perfect, and the body did not need to be held in a fixed position. Instead, sleep emerged from the interaction between flexible materials, variable terrain, and a body capable of adjusting itself within those conditions, maintaining stability not through precision, but through distribution and change. Over long stretches of time, the difference between a broad surface and a shaped object did more than influence comfort. It shaped expectations. When a person rests on a shared surface that responds to the entire body, there is no single point that defines how sleep should feel. There is no fixed height for the head, no predetermined angle for the neck, and no clear boundary between where the body ends and the resting place begins. Instead, there is a gradual transition where the surface rises and falls with the contours of the body, and where the head finds its place within that larger pattern. This absence of precision does not mean a lack of stability. It means that stability is achieved differently through a balance that spreads across multiple points rather than concentrating in one location. In early human settings, where materials were gathered rather than shaped, this kind of balance would have been the norm. A layer of plant matter might compress more under the hips than under the shoulders, or shift slightly as the body moved. The head, resting within the same layer, would respond to these changes without needing to be held in place. If the surface became uneven, the body could adjust. If it flattened over time, the body could adjust again. There was no expectation that the surface should maintain a fixed form throughout the night. Instead, both the body and the surface participated in a quiet exchange, each influencing the other in small and continuous ways. This exchange is important when considering how sleep functioned across much of human history. It suggests that rest did not depend on achieving a single correct posture at the beginning of the night. Rather, it depended on the ability to maintain a range of acceptable positions, shifting slightly as needed to avoid discomfort. The head, as part of this system, did not require constant elevation or isolation. It remained integrated within the overall contact between body and surface. Even when materials were improved or layered more carefully, they did not necessarily change this relationship. A thicker bed of leaves or a more carefully arranged hide could increase softness or warmth, but it still behaved as a continuous surface rather than as a collection of separate supports. The head might sink a little more, or the shoulders might be cushioned more evenly, but the overall structure remained shared. This continuity helps explain why the transition towards specialized objects like pillows did not occur immediately when humans began to modify their environments more actively. The need for such objects was not urgent, because the existing system already allowed for rest through adaptation and distribution. It was only when surfaces themselves began to change in more structured ways, becoming flatter, firmer, or more uniform, that a gap could appear between the head and the rest of the body. That gap would later invite the introduction of a separate support. But before that moment, across the long period when human life remained closely tied to natural materials and shifting terrain, the surface of sleep remained unified. The body lay within it, not above it, and the head was part of that same continuous contact. From this perspective, the absence of a pillow is not simply the absence of an object. It is the presence of a different system, one in which the body and the surface work together without clear division, creating rest through a shared and flexible relationship that did not require the head to be lifted away from the ground in order for sleep to occur. Without a pillow to set the height of the head in advance, sleep depended more heavily on position, and position depended on the body's ability to adapt. This meant that the posture of sleep across most of human history was probably not organized around one ideal arrangement repeated in the same way every night. It was more flexible than that, shaped by surface, temperature, fatigue, and the immediate condition of the body. A person lying on bare earth, on a layer of plant matter, or on an animal hide spread over uneven ground, would not necessarily remain flat in the rigid sense that modern imagery sometimes suggests. The body could turn slightly, bend at the knees, draw the arms inward, or rest partly on one side. Each of these changes altered the relationship between the head, the shoulders, and the rest of the spine. In the absence of a separate support under the head, these changes were not minor. They were the main way the body created comfort and stability. A shoulder placed beneath part of the upper body could raise the head just enough. An arm bent near the chest could change the angle of the neck. A slight rotation of the torso could reduce pressure on the back or hips and create a more sustainable resting posture. None of these adjustments required a constructed object. They relied on the body itself as a system of compensation. Looking back toward the earlier periods of human existence, close to the long beginning of our species, this flexibility makes sense. Human groups moved through environments that were rarely uniform, and the places where they slept were likely shaped by what was available at that moment, rather than by a fixed standard of arrangement. Under those conditions, a body that could sleep in more than one posture would have been far more useful than a body that depended on precise support. This does not mean that every position was equally common, or that there was no discomfort. It means that the ability to rest likely came from variation, rather than from a single perfected form. Even today, people without pillows often do not simply remain still on their backs. They roll to the side, bend the legs, tuck one arm beneath the head or near the face, and change posture during the night. These are ordinary responses, but they may also preserve something older, the tendency to solve the problem of rest through movement and position before solving it through equipment. In a colder setting, the body might curl inward, reducing exposed surface area and bringing the head closer to the chest. In a warmer setting, the body might lengthen more fully, using the broad surface beneath it to release heat. In either case, posture remained connected to environmental conditions, not only to anatomy. The absence of a pillow made the body more responsive to place. The head could not be set at one fixed angle, while everything else remained unchanged. Instead, the entire form adjusted together. This broader relationship between posture and setting may help explain why pillows emerged slowly and unevenly in human history. Before sleep became associated with flatter, more standardized surfaces, the body itself could create small elevations and gentle supports through position alone. The sleeping posture was not something added from outside. It was something negotiated between body and ground, repeated across generations in environments where the earth remained the first bed. From that perspective, the question is not simply how humans slept without pillows, but how many different ways the body may have learned to rest before a distinct object beneath the head began to narrow those possibilities into a more fixed expectation. A sleep posture formed on the ground was rarely just a matter of preference. It was a response to the shape of the surface, the condition of the body, and the wider environment in which rest had to happen. Without a pillow to determine where the head should be, posture remained open, adjustable, and closely tied to immediate circumstances. This meant that the body did not approach sleep as a fixed arrangement to be reproduced night after night. It approached sleep as something that had to be found again, each time through position. A slight turn of the torso could reduce pressure on the spine. A bend in the knees could soften the pull across the lower back. A shoulder angled forward could create enough space for the head to settle more easily when lying on one side. These were not special techniques. They were ordinary bodily responses, repeated so often over long stretches of human history that they likely formed part of the natural rhythm of lying down. In this setting, the body did not treat the head as an isolated problem that required a separate object beneath it. The head followed the posture of the rest of the body. If the torso curled, the neck changed with it. If the chest rotated, the head found a different resting angle. If one arm was drawn inward, it could slightly alter the height and balance of the upper body, changing how the head met the ground. This makes sleep without a pillow easier to understand when seen from the perspective of the whole body rather than from the neck alone. Across early human environments, such flexibility would have mattered greatly. A sleeping place might be flatter one night and more uneven the next. A layer of leaves might compress differently from a stretched hide or from bare earth. In such conditions, a posture that could shift in small ways would be more practical than one dependent on a fixed height beneath the head. This suggests that variation itself may have been part of normal rest. The body could begin the night in one position and pass through several others, each one offering temporary relief to different pressure points. Rather than interrupting rest, these adjustments may have supported it, preventing the build-up of strain in one part of the body for too long. Looking back toward the earlier phases of human life, near the long beginning of our species, this capacity for multiple sleeping postures fits a world where the body had to remain adaptable in nearly every other domain as well. The same body that walked across uneven land, crouched, climbed, carried and balanced, would also sleep in ways that preserved flexibility. There is little reason to imagine that one perfect sleeping posture governed such a long period. It is more likely that a range of workable postures existed, shaped by climate, terrain, body condition, and available materials. Even in modern life, when people are tired enough or when they rest on unfamiliar surfaces, the body often returns to these simpler adjustments. It folds, turns, and tests different angles until a stable position appears. That impulse may not be new at all. It may be an old bodily memory of solving discomfort through movement instead of equipment. From this perspective, the later spread of pillows did more than add softness. It began to define what sleep posture should be. It narrowed variation by giving the head a predetermined place. But for most of human history, before sleep surfaces became more standardized and before the head was regularly elevated, posture remained the main instrument of rest. The body did not wait for the environment to provide precision. It created enough precision through its own changing form, again and again, on the ground that shaped the first human nights. Over many generations, a flexible way of sleeping may have shaped more than posture alone. It may also have shaped what the body expected from the act of rest. In a world without pillows, the head was not guided toward one prepared height each night. It had to arrive there through the position of the rest of the body, and that meant sleep began as a whole-body adjustment. The body did not simply lie down and remain exactly as it was. It folded, turned, released, and settled in stages. A slight shift of the shoulder could change the angle of the neck. A bent arm could create a temporary support. A turn toward one side could reduce pressure on the back, while a return toward the back could ease the hips or ribs after some time had passed. None of these movements required conscious planning. They were ordinary responses within a body that had learned to rest on surfaces that were rarely perfect and never identical for long. This matters because it suggests that, across much of human history, sleep may have depended less on achieving one ideal posture and more on remaining capable of moving among several acceptable ones. That kind of flexibility would have been especially useful in environments close to the deep origin of human life, where sleeping places were shaped by terrain, weather, available materials, and the repeated use of the same ground rather than by fixed constructions. A flatter patch of earth might allow the body to extend more fully. A colder night might encourage a more curled posture that brought the head inward and reduced exposure. A rougher surface might lead the body to favor one side before slowly shifting away from it later. In each case, posture remained responsive to place. The head did not stand apart from these changes. It moved with them, its position emerging from the arrangement of shoulders, arms, and torso rather than from a separate support placed beneath it. This also helps explain why the absence of a pillow does not automatically mean the absence of comfort. Comfort, in this older sense, may have been less about stillness and more about successful adjustment. A body that could keep changing slightly during the night could avoid locking itself into strain. A shoulder could bear weight for a time, then release it. The upper spine could rotate gently, then settle again. The neck could find relief not because it had been fixed in the correct angle from the beginning, but because the entire body kept negotiating with the surface below. Even now, many people still move through several positions in sleep without remembering them. That tendency may preserve something ancient. Long before specialized sleep objects became common, the body was already solving the problem of rest through motion, posture, and adaptation. Seen this way, pillows did not create the first stable sleep. They introduced a different way of organizing it. They gave the head a designated place and reduced the degree to which the rest of the body had to improvise. But before that shift, for most of human history, posture itself was one of the main tools of rest. The ground was the first bed, the body was the first support system, and sleep remained a changing arrangement rather than a fixed design. That older arrangement may not have been uniform everywhere, and it should not be imagined as identical across all climates or human groups. Yet the larger pattern remains clear enough to matter. Before the head was regularly raised on a separate object, the body learned to rest through variation, and that variation may be one of the deepest clues to how humans once slept so long without a pillow at all. When the head rests directly against the same surface as the rest of the body, it becomes part of a broader exchange that is easy to overlook in modern environments. The head is not only a structure of bones and muscles, it is also an area through which heat is constantly lost and regulated. Without a pillow creating separation, the head remains in contact with the ground or with whatever material lies beneath, and that contact changes how heat moves between the body and the surrounding environment. In cooler conditions, the ground can draw warmth away from the body, and the head participates in that process just as the shoulders and back do. This does not mean the head is uniquely vulnerable, but it does mean that its position becomes part of a larger pattern of thermal balance. The body, sensing changes in temperature, may respond by adjusting posture rather than by adding external insulation in a precise way. A slight turn inward can reduce exposure. Drawing the chin closer to the chest can shorten the surface through which heat is lost. Bringing the arms closer to the torso can create small pockets of retained warmth. In each case, the position of the head changes not because it needs support from below, but because it is involved in maintaining a stable internal temperature. Across long periods of early human existence, where nights could vary in temperature and where materials for insulation were limited or unevenly available, this kind of adjustment would have been essential. The absence of a pillow did not remove protection. It required the body to use its own structure and position to manage heat. In warmer environments, the same contact between the head and the surface could have a different effect. Instead of conserving warmth, the body might benefit from releasing it. Lying more fully extended, with the head resting openly against the ground, could allow heat to dissipate more easily. The surface beneath, depending on its composition, might feel cooler than the surrounding air, creating a subtle exchange that helps regulate body temperature. Again, the head is not treated separately. It participates in the same process as the rest of the body. This shared role reinforces the idea that sleep in earlier environments was not organized around isolated solutions. It was shaped by systems that involved the entire body interacting with the environment as a whole. Archaeological evidence, while indirect, supports the idea that early sleeping areas were often simple and closely tied to environmental conditions. Layers of plant material or animal skins may have been used to reduce direct contact with cold or damp ground, but these layers did not isolate the head or create a distinct thermal barrier beneath it. Instead, they acted broadly, affecting the entire body. The head remained within that same system of contact and exchange. Over time, as human groups began to occupy more controlled environments and as materials became more consistently available, the way heat was managed during sleep also began to change. Raised surfaces, enclosed spaces, and layered bedding introduced new patterns of insulation and separation. Within those new patterns, the head could be lifted away from the ground, reducing direct heat exchange and altering how temperature was experienced during rest. But before those changes became common, the head remained part of a continuous relationship with the surface beneath it. The absence of a pillow, in this context, was not simply about posture. It was also about how the body managed its interaction with temperature. The ground, the air, and the body formed a system in which heat moved gradually and where position played a central role in maintaining balance. This suggests that the question of why humans slept without pillows for so long cannot be separated from the conditions under which they slept. It is not only a question of structure, but of environment, where the head was never fully removed from the broader physical processes that shaped human rest. As night deepened and temperatures shifted, the body did not remain passive beneath these changes. It responded through position, through contact, and through subtle adjustments that involved the head as much as any other part. Without a pillow creating distance, the head stayed within the same field of temperature exchange as the shoulders, back, and limbs. This meant that any cooling or warming effect from the ground or from the surrounding air was experienced across the entire body, not divided into separate zones. In cooler conditions, where heat loss could become more noticeable over time, the body often moved toward configurations that reduced exposure. The head, rather than being lifted away, might be drawn closer to the chest or turned slightly inward. following the curve of the upper body. This reduced the surface area exposed to the air and brought the head into closer proximity with the warmer parts of the torso. The absence of a pillow allowed this adjustment to happen without constraint, because there was no fixed height or angle that needed to be maintained. The head could follow the body's movement freely, responding to the same signals of temperature and comfort. In warmer conditions, the opposite pattern could appear. The body might extend more fully, increasing the area through which heat could dissipate. The head, resting directly on the surface, remained part of this broader release. Contact with the ground could provide a slight cooling effect, depending on the material and the time of night, and the head participated in that exchange, just as the rest of the body did. These shifts were not abrupt. They happened gradually, often without waking, as part of the body's ongoing regulation of its internal state. Across much of human history, where nights could be long and where artificial control of temperature was limited, this kind of responsiveness would have been important. The body could not rely on a stable indoor climate or on layered bedding designed for consistent insulation. Instead, it relied on its own ability to adjust posture in response to changing conditions. The head, remaining close to the surface, was included in these adjustments rather than separated from them. Even when simple materials were used to improve the sleeping surface, such as plant layers or animal skins, they tended to affect the entire body in a similar way. They might reduce the rate of heat loss or soften contact with the ground, but they did not create a distinct thermal zone for the head. The head remained within the same system of exchange, responding to temperature alongside the rest of the body. This continuity suggests that the absence of a pillow did not leave the head unprotected. It placed the head within a broader, more integrated pattern of thermal regulation. The body did not solve temperature challenges by isolating one part. It adjusted the whole. Looking back toward early human environments, close to the long beginning of our species, this integrated response would have aligned with other aspects of life as well. Movement, shelter, and rest were all shaped by the same need to adapt to variable conditions. Sleep was not removed from this pattern. It followed the same logic, using posture and contact to maintain balance. Only later, as environments became more controlled and as materials allowed for greater separation between body and ground, did new patterns begin to appear. The introduction of objects that lifted the head altered not only posture, but also the way heat was exchanged during rest. But before that transition, for most of human history, the head remained close to the surface, participating fully in the body's ongoing effort to maintain a stable internal temperature through small, continuous adjustments that did not depend on any single external support. Over very long stretches of human history, the head remained exposed to the same nightly conditions as the rest of the body, and that fact may have shaped the experience of sleep more deeply than it first appears. A modern pillow does more than soften contact. It also creates a small zone of separation. It lifts the head away from the ground, reduces direct contact with cooler surfaces, and changes how warmth gathers or escapes around the neck and face. Without that separation, the head stayed within the same thermal world as the shoulders, spine, and chest. It touched the same surface, received the same rising chill from the ground, and responded within the same broader pattern of bodily adjustment. This helps explain why posture mattered so much before specialized sleep objects became common. The body could not depend on a fixed device beneath the head to manage comfort or temperature. It had to make continuous, small corrections through position. In a colder setting, the head might be turned inward toward the body, the chin lowered, the shoulders rounded slightly forward. These movements did not only protect the neck, they reduced exposure, held warmth closer, and made the whole upper body function more like a single thermal unit. In a milder or warmer setting, the body could open again. The head could rest more freely against the surface, no longer drawn inward for protection, and the wider posture allowed warmth to leave the body more easily. In both cases, the head was not treated as a separate problem. It remained part of the same system through which the body regulated itself across the night. Looking back toward the earlier human world, close to the beginning of our species and through the many generations that lived without controlled sleeping interiors, this integrated arrangement makes sense. Nights were not standardized. Surfaces differed, climates differed, and the materials available for rest differed from place to place. Yet one broad pattern remained stable. Sleep had to be achieved through the body's ability to negotiate with its environment. The head resting near the ground was part of that negotiation. It allowed direct contact, direct response, and direct participation in the exchange of heat. Even when grasses, hides, or other materials were placed beneath the body, they usually softened and insulated broadly rather than isolating the head into a special condition. The body still functioned as a whole, and the head still followed the logic of the whole. This may also help explain why the appearance of pillows was gradual rather than immediate. The older system was not necessarily failing, it was simply organized differently. As long as sleeping surfaces remained broad, uneven, and close to the earth, and as long as rest depended on posture, flexibility, and shared contact, there was little reason for the head to become fully separated from the body's thermal adjustments. Only later, when sleeping places became flatter, more controlled, and more insulated overall, could the head begin to be lifted into a different relationship with the surface below. From that point onward, sleep could be reorganized around localized support. But before that shift, for most humans who ever lived, the head remained part of a wider environmental exchange. It lost heat with the body, retained warmth with the body, and changed position with the body. The absence of a pillow was therefore not only about what humans lacked, it reflected the presence of an older arrangement, one in which the body rested close to the world that surrounded it, and where even the position of the head remained tied to the basic realities of ground, air, and temperature that shaped human sleep from the beginning. Before walls, lamps, and controlled sleeping rooms became common, night was organized around one of the few forces humans could shape directly: fire. Fire changed darkness, but it also changed space. Once a fire was lit, the ground around it was no longer neutral. Some areas became warmer, some brighter, some safer, and some less comfortable because of smoke, sparks, or shifting heat. In that altered space, the position of the sleeping body mattered, and the position of the head mattered with it. Without a pillow to fix the angle of the neck in advance, the head remained responsive to the conditions created by the fire. It could turn away from smoke, angle toward warmth, lower closer to a protected side of the body, or shift as the body adjusted to changing heat through the night. This suggests that fire did not merely help humans sleep, it helped shape how they arranged themselves while sleeping. The ground was still the first bed, but once fire entered the human night, that bed gained a center, and the body had to respond to that center. In cooler environments especially, the side of the body facing the fire might receive more warmth than the side turned away. This uneven heating would make posture important. A person lying too directly toward the fire might become too warm on one side while the other remained cool. A person too far from the fire might lose the benefit of its heat altogether. The head, exposed and sensitive to smoke and warmth, would not remain indifferent to this arrangement. If smoke drifted low, the body might turn slightly. If the face became too warm, the head might rotate away. If the fire weakened toward the later part of the night, the body might curl more closely inward, bringing the head with it. These changes did not require a separate support beneath the head. They required flexibility, because the conditions around the fire were rarely stable for long. The flames changed. The smoke shifted. The heat rose and faded. Sleep happened within that changing field. Looking back toward the earlier human world, where nights were colder, darker, and less sheltered than many later sleeping environments, this role of fire becomes especially important. Fire did more than provide comfort. It reorganized the sleeping space itself. People resting near it had to consider distance, direction, and exposure. A simple layer of grass or hide beneath the body could soften the ground, but it could not solve the shifting conditions created by flame and smoke. The body still had to do that through position. The head, because it was close to the air and directly affected by smoke, likely remained especially responsive to these adjustments. This may help explain why a fixed object under the head was not always useful in such settings. A pillow creates a stable height, but fire creates unstable conditions. When the surrounding space changes through the night, the body may benefit more from freedom to turn, lower, or reposition than from being held in one defined angle. Even today, when people rest near a campfire, they often orient the body carefully, not simply for warmth, but to avoid smoke and manage uneven heat. That pattern may reflect something very old. Long before modern sleeping rooms, the human body was already learning to rest in relation to a fire that shaped the air, the temperature, and the organization of space around it. From this perspective, the long absence of pillows was not only connected to the ground, posture, or body structure, it was also connected to the changing geometry of the night once fire became part of it. Sleep was no longer just a meeting between body and earth. It became a quiet negotiation among body, ground, air, and flame, and the head remained within that negotiation rather than being fixed above it by a separate object. As fire became a more regular part of human nights, sleep was no longer shaped only by the ground beneath the body, but also by the moving conditions above it. Heat did not spread evenly. Smoke did not rise in a simple straight line and disappear. Air shifted, flames weakened, embers brightened, and the space around the fire changed in subtle ways through the night. This made the sleeping place dynamic rather than fixed. A person resting near a fire could not rely on one perfect arrangement that would remain suitable until morning. The body had to remain responsive, and the head, exposed to warmth and smoke more directly than much of the rest of the body, had to remain responsive as well. Without a pillow fixing the angle of the neck, the head could turn with far greater freedom, and that freedom may have been more useful than it first seems. A slight turn away from smoke could make rest easier. A lower position closer to the shoulder could reduce exposure to moving air. A change in the direction of the face could help balance warmth when one side of the body was receiving more heat than the other. These were not dramatic actions. They were quiet corrections, repeated as conditions changed. In this setting, the absence of a pillow did not mean the absence of support. It meant the presence of adaptability. The body could respond to the fire because it was not locked into a single prepared height beneath the head. Looking back toward the long earlier world of human sleep, this matters because fire introduced not only comfort, but asymmetry. One side of the body could be warmer. One side of the face could feel more exposed. The air near the ground might differ from the air slightly above it, and smoke could drift in low layers depending on fuel, wind, or shelter. In such an environment, the head was part of a changing field, not a separate object to be stabilized once and forgotten. Even the choice of where to lie in relation to the fire would influence how the night unfolded. Too close, and the warmth might become uneven or excessive. Too far, and the fire might lose much of its value as temperatures fell. Too directly in the path of smoke, and the face and eyes would be affected. This suggests that sleep near fire depended not only on heat, but on orientation. The body had to find a position in relation to flame, air, and ground all at once. A broad surface beneath the body could soften contact with the earth, but it could not solve the problem of drifting smoke or shifting warmth. Only posture could do that. The head, free to rotate, lower, or turn inward, remained one of the most important parts of that adjustment. This may also help explain why a fixed support under the head would not always have been ideal in such settings. A pillow can help maintain one angle, but the environment around a fire rarely maintains one condition. The freedom to change position may have mattered more than localized softness. Even in much later times, whenever people sleep close to open flame or open air, they still tend to orient the body carefully and change position as conditions shift. That old pattern likely reaches far back. Before sleeping spaces became controlled and separated from the direct effects of fire, the night remained active around the resting body. Heat rose, smoke wandered, and the body answered with motion small enough not to break rest, yet constant enough to preserve it. In that older world, the head was not raised out of the problem. It remained inside it, adjusting with the rest of the body to a sleeping environment that fire had transformed but never fully stabilized. Over time, the presence of fire may have done something subtle but important to the human night. It may have taught the resting body that sleep was not a fully closed state, but a condition of partial adjustment within an environment that continued to change. The ground beneath remained one part of that environment, but the fire introduced another. Warmth moved unevenly. Smoke drifted in shifting patterns. The brightness of embers rose and fell. Air currents changed direction. In such a setting, the sleeping body could not become entirely indifferent to its surroundings, and the head, exposed to air and heat more directly than much of the torso, likely remained especially responsive. This helps explain why a fixed support beneath the head would not necessarily fit the logic of that older sleeping world. A pillow creates a stable angle and a defined resting height, but fire often created unstable conditions. The side of the face turned toward the flames might grow warm while the opposite side cooled. The smoke might be tolerable for a time, then shift lower and require a slight turn. The body might begin the night more extended when the fire was strong, then curl inward later as warmth faded. Each of these changes would alter the position of the head, not as an isolated choice, but as part of a larger whole-body response. The head remained mobile because the environment asked for mobility. Looking back toward the earlier stages of human life, close to the long origin of our species and across many thousands of generations, this would have mattered greatly. Fire did not create a controlled bedroom. It created a center of temporary warmth in an otherwise uncertain night. Around that center, the body had to negotiate distance, direction, and exposure. Sleep therefore remained flexible. A person might lie with the back partly toward the fire to warm one side, then turn later as the embers settled. Another might angle the face away from the smoke while keeping the torso within the fire's reach. The head could lower closer to an arm, rest nearer the shoulder, or rotate slightly to reduce irritation from smoke or excess warmth. None of this required a specialized object beneath the head. What it required was freedom to respond. That freedom may be one reason why the long absence of pillows is easier to understand when sleep is viewed not as a quest for perfect stillness, but as a process of quiet adjustment. The body did not solve all discomfort in advance. It managed changing conditions as they came. Fire made this especially clear because it brought both benefit and complication. It offered warmth, light, and perhaps a greater sense of safety, but it also reshaped the air and temperature around the sleeping body in ways that could never remain perfectly constant until morning. Even simple sleeping surfaces made of plant matter or hides would not remove that instability. They softened the ground, but they did not control the night air. The head, still close to the body and still open to the movement of smoke and warmth, remained part of the body's larger effort to find sustainable rest. From this perspective, the role of fire helps deepen the answer to the title question. Humans did not simply fail to invent pillows for a long time. For much of their history, they slept in conditions where flexibility may have mattered more than fixed support. The head was not raised out of the shifting environment around the fire. It stayed within it, responding with small changes in angle and posture that worked with the rest of the body. In that older arrangement, sleep was shaped by ground, temperature, smoke, and bodily adaptation all at once. The fire gave the night a center, but not a stable one, and so the body, including the head, remained close to the earth and free to move within a sleeping world that was warmed by flame, disturbed by air, and never fully separated from the environment around it. For most of human history, sleep was not only a relationship between one body and the ground, it was also a relationship between bodies resting near one another. Humans rarely lived as isolated sleepers in separate rooms with fixed personal spaces. In earlier environments, rest often happened in groups, and that fact changed how warmth, safety, and physical positioning were managed through the night. When bodies lie near one another, the sleeping space becomes different from an empty surface. Heat is shared more easily. Exposure can be reduced. The ground itself may still be firm or uneven, but the social arrangement of bodies adds another layer to the sleeping environment. In such a setting, the head does not always need to rely on a separate object for support or comfort, because proximity to others can change posture, orientation, and the overall feeling of rest. A person sleeping beside others may draw the body slightly inward, angle the shoulders differently, or rest with the head turned in relation to the group, rather than to an individual sleeping plan. This does not mean that people used one another as deliberate substitutes for pillows in any simple or universal way. That would go further than the evidence allows, but it does suggest that shared sleeping made the absence of specialized head support easier to sustain. The body was not resting alone in an empty, neutral space. It was resting within a human arrangement shaped by closeness, by warmth, and by the practical realities of night. Looking back toward the long beginning of human life, this matters because group sleep was likely common in many settings where darkness, cold, and uncertainty made closeness useful. The same fire that provided warmth could not warm every body equally at all times, and the same ground that supported one sleeper could support several. In that context, people sleeping near one another would create small zones of retained heat and reduced exposure. The head, remaining close to the rest of the body and close to other bodies, stayed inside that shared thermal space rather than being lifted away into a separate condition. This may have reduced the need for distinct objects placed beneath the head, because comfort and stability were being created through a broader arrangement of posture and proximity. Even simple changes in distance could matter. A body turned toward the group might conserve warmth differently than a body turned outward. A shoulder angled inward could alter how the neck rested. The head might remain lower, closer to the chest or shoulder, because the surrounding conditions made that posture more sustainable. In modern sleep, individual comfort is often treated as something highly personal and carefully adjusted through private objects. But across much of human history, sleep may have been less individualized and more collective in its basic structure. The sleeping body was not only adjusting to terrain, air, and temperature, it was also adjusting to the presence of others nearby. This broadens the answer to the title in an important way. Humans may not have needed pillows for so long, not only because the ground was the first bed and the body was adaptable, but also because sleep itself was often embedded within a group. In a shared sleeping environment, the body could rely on a combination of posture, surface, warmth, and proximity rather than on specialized equipment. From that perspective, the long absence of pillows begins to look less like a missing comfort and more like part of an older system of rest, one in which humans slept not only close to the earth, but close to one another, and where the arrangement of the group quietly shaped how each individual head came to rest through the night. When several bodies rest within the same space, the surface beneath them is no longer experienced in the same way as when one body lies alone. The ground remains the same in material, but the conditions above it begin to change. Heat accumulates more easily, small air currents are altered, and the distribution of pressure across the surface becomes more varied as each person settles into position. In such an arrangement, the body does not only respond to the ground, it also responds to the presence of others, and this changes how posture forms during sleep. Without a pillow to define the position of the head in advance, the head remains part of a system that includes nearby bodies as well as the surface below. A slight shift in one person's posture may influence the space available to another. A shoulder placed closer to the group may create a different angle for the neck than a shoulder turned outward. The head may turn toward or away from others depending on warmth, comfort, or the simple need for space. These adjustments are not precise or planned. They are small and continuous, shaped by proximity and by the shared conditions of the sleeping area. In early human environments, where sleeping often occurred in groups and where the night brought both cold and uncertainty, this kind of shared arrangement would have been common. The body could conserve warmth more effectively when close to others, and that shared warmth would influence posture. A person might draw the limbs inward, angle the torso slightly toward the group, or position the head in a way that kept it within a warmer zone. The absence of a pillow made this easier because the head was not fixed at a particular height or angle. It could adjust freely, following the body's orientation within the group. Even the spacing between individuals could shape how each person rested. If space was limited, the body might adopt a more compact posture. If space allowed, the body might extend more fully, but still remain oriented in relation to others nearby. In both cases, the head remained integrated into the overall arrangement rather than isolated as a separate element. This suggests that sleep, in such settings, was not organized around individual precision. It was organized around shared conditions, where each body found its position within a collective pattern. The surface beneath remained important, but it was no longer the only factor. The presence of others added another layer of influence, one that could reduce the need for specialized supports. Looking back toward the long early phases of human life, this helps explain why the absence of pillows did not necessarily create a problem that needed to be solved immediately. The body was not alone, and the environment of sleep was not neutral. It was shaped by closeness, by warmth, and by the subtle ways in which people adjusted to one another through the night. Even today, when people rest in shared spaces, posture often changes without conscious effort. The body angles differently, the head finds a position that fits within the available space, and small adjustments continue as conditions shift. That pattern may carry forward something very old. Before sleep became an individual activity separated into private spaces, it was part of a shared experience, and within that experience, the head did not require a fixed support beneath it. It found its place through the same process that shaped the rest of the body, responding not only to the ground, but to the presence of others resting close by. Over long stretches of human history, Shared sleep may have shaped expectations of rest in ways that are easy to miss from a modern point of view. Today, many people imagine sleep as an individual arrangement, with one body, one bed, one pillow, and a carefully adjusted private space. But in earlier human settings, rest was often less separate than that. It happened near others, within the same warmth, within the same darkness, and often within the same limited sleeping area. In that older pattern, the body did not come to rest in isolation. It settled into a human landscape, where nearby bodies affected temperature, spacing, posture, and the overall structure of the night. This matters because the need for a specialized object beneath the head may be lower in a sleeping environment shaped by proximity rather than by separation. When people lie near one another, the body is influenced not only by the firmness of the ground, but also by the arrangement of the group. A person may turn inward toward shared warmth, fold the arms closer to the torso, or angle the shoulders in a way that changes how the head meets the surface. The head, in this setting, remains part of a broader response. It does not need to be treated as a separate mechanical problem. Its position emerges from how the whole body fits within the group. This does not mean that every sleeping group was organized in the same way, or that all human communities rested in identical patterns. Human life has always been varied across climates, landscapes, and cultural forms. But it is broadly reasonable to say that sleep in many early contexts was social rather than strictly private, and that this social arrangement changed the physical conditions of rest. Heat could be shared. Exposure to open air could be reduced. The sleeping posture of one person could influence the posture of another. A body might remain slightly curled not only because of temperature, but because of available space. A head might rest lower, or turn in a particular direction because the group created a certain orientation of bodies on the ground. Looking back toward the earlier human world, close to the deep beginning of our species and through the many generations that lived without separate sleeping rooms or individualized bedding, this shared arrangement may help explain why pillows were absent for so long without creating an obvious crisis. Sleep was supported by more than one factor at once. The ground mattered. The body's own flexibility mattered. Fire mattered. Temperature mattered, and the presence of others mattered too. All of these worked together to create enough stability for rest. In that older system, comfort was not concentrated into one object placed under the head. It was distributed across a wider network of conditions. Even now, traces of this older pattern remain visible when people sleep in groups during travel, in shelters, or in temporary conditions. The body still adjusts socially. It makes room, turns differently, shares warmth, and finds rest within a collective arrangement rather than an individually perfected one. From this perspective, the long history of sleeping without a pillow becomes easier to understand. It was not simply a matter of lacking an invention. It reflected a world in which human rest was shaped by closeness, and where the sleeping body often depended on shared space more than on specialized support. The head came to rest not above the group, but within it, close to the shoulders, close to the ground, and close to other human bodies whose presence quietly changed what sleep required. When we look back into the deep past, the act of sleep leaves very little behind. Unlike tools, bones, or structures, the way a body rests does not preserve itself easily in the archaeological record. There are no clear imprints of a head position that can be studied across thousands of years, no consistent trace of posture that can be measured and compared. What remains instead are indirect signs, areas of repeated use, layers of plant material, changes in soil, and the arrangement of space within shelters or open sites. From these fragments, a broader picture begins to emerge, not of exact positions, but of the kinds of environments in which people likely rested. These environments, across many different regions and time periods, tend to show something consistent. Sleeping places were often simple, close to the ground, and shaped more by use than by design. In some locations, archaeologists have found areas where plant material appears to have been gathered and laid down repeatedly, creating a softer surface over time. In others, the ground shows signs of smoothing or compaction, suggesting that people return to the same spots again and again. These findings do not tell us precisely how the head was positioned, but they do suggest that the surface of rest remained broad and continuous. There is little indication of objects specifically shaped to raise or isolate the head in these early contexts. Instead, the evidence points toward a general preparation of space rather than a specialized arrangement for one part of the body. This distinction is important because it aligns with the broader pattern suggested by the body and the environment. If early humans had regularly depended on objects placed beneath the head, we might expect to find clearer traces of such objects, or at least consistent signs of a distinct raised area within sleeping spaces. Yet the archaeological record, limited as it is, tends to show surfaces that were shared across the body rather than divided into separate zones of support. Looking back toward the earliest phases of human existence, near the long origin of our species, this absence of clear head support artifacts suggests that sleep was organized differently from the beginning. The body rested on prepared ground, sometimes softened, sometimes insulated, but rarely transformed into a structured bed with defined components. Even in later periods, when more complex living spaces began to appear, the introduction of specialized sleeping objects seems to have been gradual and uneven. Some cultures developed forms of head support earlier than others, often tied to specific materials or social practices, while many others continued to rely on simpler surfaces for long periods of time. This uneven development suggests that the need for a pillow was not universal or immediate. It emerged within particular contexts, rather than as a direct response to a basic biological requirement. The archaeological record, in this sense, does not provide a detailed map of how every human slept, but it does offer a consistent background. Sleep happened close to the ground, on surfaces that were shaped by repetition rather than precision, and without clear evidence of widespread, early use of objects designed specifically to lift the head. From this perspective, the absence of pillows across most of human history is not an empty gap in the record. It is part of a broader pattern, one in which rest was embedded in the environment and supported by general conditions rather than by specialized tools. The traces that remain are quiet, but they point toward a form of sleep that did not separate the head from the body and did not require a distinct object to create the conditions for rest. Archaeology rarely preserves sleep in a direct way, but it does preserve patterns of repeated human behavior, and those patterns can still tell us something important about how rest was organized. When the same place is used again and again, traces begin to accumulate. Plant remains may gather in unusual concentration. Soil may become compacted in a localized area. Ash, debris, and the arrangement of nearby activity zones may suggest where people sat, worked, and eventually lay down. None of this gives a perfect picture, and it must be interpreted carefully. But taken together, such signs help archaeologists distinguish spaces of rest from spaces of other activity. What is striking in many of these cases is not the presence of finely shaped sleeping equipment, but the evidence of broad preparation. A surface may have been cleared. A layer of vegetation may have been placed down. A certain patch of ground may have been used repeatedly enough to stand out from the surrounding area. These are signs of attention to sleep, but not signs of specialized head support. The difference matters. A prepared surface tells us that humans cared about where and how they rested. It does not tell us that they needed to raise the head on a separate object in order to do so. In some archaeological contexts, especially in caves or sheltered sites, researchers have found evidence that plant material was intentionally gathered and placed in specific locations, sometimes with repeated renewal over time. This suggests an effort to make the ground cleaner, softer, or more insulated. Yet even here, the preparation appears broad rather than divided into zones. The material was spread as a general layer, not arranged into a clearly distinct structure for the head. That pattern fits closely with the wider picture suggested by anatomy and environment. The whole body came down onto a prepared area, but the head was not singled out in a way that would resemble the later logic of a pillow. Looking back toward the early human world, close to the beginning of our species and through the many thousands of generations that followed, this kind of evidence is important precisely because it is modest. It does not force dramatic conclusions. It simply suggests continuity. People improved the sleeping surface when they could, but improvement did not automatically mean specialization. A smoother place to lie down is not the same as a separate device beneath the head. A bed of grasses is not yet a pillow. A hide placed over earth still behaves as a surface, not as a shaped support for one part of the body alone. Archaeology also reminds us that many of the materials humans once used for sleep would have disappeared long ago. Soft plant matter decays, fibers break down, Light organic materials leave only partial traces, if any. Because of this, caution is necessary. We cannot say that no human group ever improvised something beneath the head in any context. What we can say more carefully is that the archaeological record does not show strong, widespread early evidence of specialized head supports across most of human history. What it shows much more clearly is attention to the sleeping place as a whole. This distinction helps answer the title without overstating the case. The long absence of pillows was not the absence of care. It was the presence of a different kind of care, one focused on preparing ground, choosing location, using available materials, and returning to familiar resting places. The head remained part of that broader arrangement. It did not yet occupy a separate category in the design of sleep. From this perspective, the archaeological traces of rest support a quiet but important conclusion. For most humans across most of time, sleep seems to have been organized around surfaces, not around separate supports for the head. The evidence is indirect, but it points in a consistent direction. Humans shaped places to rest, not yet objects to hold the head above the rest of the body through the night. Across different regions and long spans of time, the archaeological picture remains uneven in detail but steady in its broader pattern. What survives tends to be what endures: stone, bone, traces of fire, and subtle changes in the ground. What disappears tends to be what is soft, flexible, and organic. This difference shapes what we can know about sleep. If early humans had relied heavily on durable, shaped objects to raise the head, we might expect to find clearer, repeated evidence of such items across many sites. Instead, what appears more consistently are signs of places where people lay down, not objects designed to hold the head in a fixed position. In cave sites, in open-air locations, and in areas where surfaces show repeated human use, the pattern points toward preparation of ground rather than construction of specialized supports. Layers of plant material may have been laid down and renewed. Areas may have been kept relatively clear of sharp debris. Spaces may have been chosen for shelter from wind or proximity to warmth. These are decisions about where and how to rest, but they do not divide the sleeping body into separate zones that require distinct tools. The head remains within the same prepared space as the rest of the body. Even when considering later periods, where more complex social structures and material cultures begin to appear, the development of objects that resemble pillows does not emerge everywhere at once. In some societies, shaped headrests or raised supports appear in specific contexts, sometimes connected to status, ritual, or particular environmental conditions. In others, simpler sleeping arrangements continue for long periods without clear evidence of a separate object beneath the head. This uneven appearance suggests that the use of pillows was not a direct or universal response to a basic biological need. It developed under particular conditions, influenced by available materials, cultural practices, and changes in the way living spaces were organized. Looking back toward the deep origin of human life, before such variations became more pronounced, the consistent element remains the surface itself. Sleep happened on the ground or on materials that behaved like the ground. The body adapted to that surface, and the head was not consistently elevated away from it. Archaeology cannot tell us every detail of posture or comfort, but it can show us what was made, what was used repeatedly, and what was absent across wide areas and long periods. In that sense, the relative absence of early, widespread head support objects becomes meaningful. It suggests that human sleep did not begin with the expectation that the head required its own constructed support. Instead, rest was organized around the whole body interacting with a prepared place. This does not rule out variation. Human history is too broad for a single pattern to apply everywhere without exception, but the overall direction remains clear enough to guide understanding. The earliest and most persistent traces of sleep are tied to surfaces, to places, and to repeated use of those places, not to distinct objects that separate the head from the rest of the body. From this perspective, the archaeological record reinforces what has been suggested by the body, by the environment, and by the structure of early human life. For most of human history, sleep was grounded. It remained close to the earth, shaped by materials that softened or insulated broadly, and supported by a system in which the head was not yet treated as something that needed to be lifted into its own space. At a certain point in human history, something began to change. Not suddenly and not everywhere at once, but gradually and unevenly across different regions. The surface of sleep, which had long remained close to the ground and broadly shared by the entire body, started to take on new forms. In some early settled environments, people began to shape their living spaces more deliberately, creating flatter floors, defined sleeping areas, and, in some cases, objects that altered how the body met the surface. Within these changes, the first recognizable forms of head support appear, but they do not emerge as soft cushions. Instead, they often appear as firm, shaped objects, sometimes made of wood, stone, or other durable materials, designed to lift the head slightly above the surface. This is a notable shift, because it marks a moment when the head begins to be treated as a separate element within the structure of sleep. However, this shift does not happen in a way that suggests a universal or immediate need. Early headrests, where they appear, are not found across all human groups, and they are not always associated with everyday comfort. In some contexts, they seem to be linked to particular social practices, to specific environments, or to the materials available in that region. They may have served multiple purposes, including keeping the head elevated away from the ground, protecting hairstyles or adornments, or aligning the body in ways that held meaning within that culture. This diversity suggests that the introduction of head support was not simply a correction of a long-standing problem. It was part of a broader transformation in how humans organized their living spaces and their relationship to rest. Looking back toward the long earlier period when humans slept without pillows, the contrast becomes clearer. For most of human history, the body adapted to the surface, and the head remained integrated within that adaptation. With the appearance of early headrests, the direction begins to reverse in some places. Instead of the body fully adapting to the ground, the environment begins to be shaped to guide the body into a more defined arrangement. The head is lifted, even if only slightly, and this creates a new relationship between the neck and the rest of the body. It introduces a fixed point where previously there had been flexibility. Yet even at this stage, the concept of comfort is not identical to the modern one. A firm headrest does not compress like a pillow. It does not distribute pressure in the same way. Its function is different, and its presence reflects a different set of priorities. This is important because it reminds us that the history of pillows is not simply a linear progression from discomfort to comfort. It is a complex process shaped by environment, material culture, and social meaning. In many parts of the world, even as some groups began to use forms of head support, others continued to rely on simpler surfaces for long periods of time. The older pattern did not disappear all at once. It remained alongside newer practices, creating a landscape of variation rather than a single universal change. From this perspective, the appearance of early headrests does not contradict the long history of sleeping without pillows. It highlights how long that earlier pattern persisted, and how gradual the transition was when it began. The head was not always lifted, and when it was, the reasons could differ from what we might expect today. This moment of change, therefore, marks not the beginning of sleep, but a reorganization of it, where in some contexts the head began to occupy a distinct place within the sleeping arrangement, while in many others it remained, as it had for so long, close to the surface and part of the same continuous contact as the rest of the body. As head support began to appear in some settled societies, it did not arrive in the soft and familiar form that many people imagine today. In several early contexts, what emerged was not a pillow in the modern sense, but a hard headrest or shaped support that raised the head slightly while leaving most of the body on a flat surface. This difference matters because it shows that the first move away from sleeping directly on the ground was not simply a search for softness. It was a change in how the sleeping environment was organized. The head began, in some places, to be treated as a distinct part of the body that could be positioned differently from the torso, but that positioning was still guided by local materials, local customs, and local ideas about order, cleanliness, status, or bodily presentation. In that sense, the appearance of headrests tells us as much about changing human worlds as it does about changing sleep. Once people began living in more permanent structures, sleeping spaces could become more predictable. Floors could be leveled, rooms could be enclosed, bedding could be arranged and reused in the same place over many nights. In such settings, a fixed object beneath the head became easier to use because the surrounding conditions were more stable than those of open ground or temporary sleeping places. A headrest on a regular surface behaves differently from a headrest on uneven earth. It creates a more defined relationship between the head and the body, and that relationship can be repeated night after night. This may help explain why specialized head supports appear more clearly in settled environments than in the much longer earlier stretches of human history. The change was not only in the object itself, it was also in the wider structure of life around it. Yet even here, caution is important. The presence of early headrests in some societies does not mean that all people in those societies used them in the same way, or that they instantly replaced older sleeping patterns. Human life remained varied. Many people likely continued to sleep on simple surfaces, with the head close to the same level as the body, even while more specialized objects existed nearby. And in some cases, headrests may have carried meanings that went beyond nightly rest. They could be tied to appearance, to preserving hair arrangements, to ideas of refinement, or to social distinction. This suggests that early head support was not always a practical answer to bodily discomfort. Sometimes it may have reflected a cultural preference shaped by the new environments people were building around themselves. Looking back toward the much earlier world, close to the deep beginning of our species, this later development becomes easier to understand in contrast. For most humans across most of time, sleep did not take place in highly regular spaces. It happened in environments where the body still had to negotiate with ground, temperature, group arrangement, and fire. Under those conditions, a flexible sleeping posture made sense, and the head remained part of that flexibility. But once some people began sleeping on flatter, more controlled surfaces within more predictable interiors, the body no longer needed to adjust in exactly the same way. A fixed support for the head became more possible and perhaps more useful in those settings. Even so, the older history remained much larger. The emergence of headrests did not erase the long past in which humans slept without them. It simply marked a turning point in some places, where sleep began to shift from an environmental adaptation toward a more structured arrangement. The head, which had once remained within the broad logic of the whole body meeting the ground, started in some context to receive its own defined place. That change was real, but it was late, uneven, and deeply tied to the larger transformation of human living spaces, rather than to any sudden discovery that sleep had always been impossible without support beneath the head. As the use of shaped head support slowly spread in some parts of the world, it revealed something important about the deeper history that came before it. If a pillow or headrest had been an essential biological requirement, we would expect it to appear early, widely, and with some consistency wherever humans slept. But that is not what the long record suggests. Instead, what appears is delay, variation, and uneven adoption. In some settled societies, the head began to be lifted on firm supports. In many others, older sleeping arrangements continued, with the body still resting on broad surfaces and the head remaining close to the same level as the torso. This contrast matters because it shows that the emergence of head support was not the first answer to a timeless bodily problem. It was one possible development within a much larger history of human adaptation. The older system had already worked for an extraordinarily long time. Bodies slept on ground, on plant layers, on hides, on mats, and on simple prepared surfaces without requiring a separate object beneath the head. When headrests later appeared, they did not replace that older pattern everywhere. They coexisted with it. That coexistence suggests that what changed was not human anatomy itself, but the world around the body. Sleeping places became more stable in some regions. Floors became more even. Interiors became more permanent. Objects could be made, kept, and used in the same place over long periods. Within such conditions, the idea of giving the head its own fixed position became more practical and perhaps more meaningful. But that practicality should not be mistaken for necessity. The body had already rested for countless generations without it. Looking back toward the beginning of our species, and across the much longer span before permanent interiors became common, the late appearance of head support helps clarify the title's central question. Humans did not fail for most of their history to discover a thing they obviously needed. Rather, they lived within conditions where that thing was not yet central to sleep. The ground still shaped rest. Posture still mattered. Fire, temperature, and group sleeping still influenced how the body arranged itself at night. In that world, the head remained part of a larger sleeping system, not a separate mechanical problem demanding a dedicated solution. Even the first headrests show this difference clearly. They were often hard, shaped, and specific in form, not soft universal cushions. That alone reminds us that the earliest supports for the head emerged within cultural systems, not simply within the search for softness. They belong to particular kinds of lives, particular materials, and particular ideas of order. From this perspective, the appearance of head support marks a narrowing as much as an innovation. Sleep begins in some places to move away from broad environmental adaptation and toward a more structured arrangement. The head receives its own place. The body depends a little less on posture and a little more on objects. Yet the deeper truth remains behind that transition. For most of human history, people slept without pillows not because they had not yet invented comfort, but because sleep itself was organized differently. It was grounded, flexible, and tied to surfaces rather than separated into specialized supports. The late arrival of headrests simply makes that older pattern easier to see. It reminds us that what feels basic now was once optional, local, and new, and that the long human night was shaped for far longer by earth, body, and habit than by anything placed beneath the head. Over time, once head support existed in some places, it began to do more than serve a practical purpose. It began to teach the body a habit. A repeated sleeping arrangement, used night after night in a stable environment, can slowly become something expected. What was once optional can begin to feel necessary, not because the body has changed in any sudden biological way, but because the surrounding pattern of life has become more regular. This appears to be one of the most important shifts in the history of the pillow. At first, a support beneath the head was likely tied to particular settings, materials, or cultural practices, but as sleeping spaces became more controlled, more permanent, and more repeatable, the support beneath the head could also become repeatable. The body no longer had to negotiate with uneven ground, changing surfaces, shared warmth, or the shifting effects of open air in quite the same way. Instead, it met the same general arrangement again and again: a flatter surface, a more defined sleeping place, and eventually an object that held the head at a familiar height. When that happens over long periods, function can become habit. The body begins not only to use a support, but to anticipate it. This does not mean the body suddenly becomes incapable of sleeping without one. It means that expectation itself starts to shape the experience of rest. A neck accustomed to one angle may notice a different angle more sharply. A sleeper used to the same height each night may feel the absence of that height more strongly, even if earlier humans lived for countless generations without it. In this way, the history of the pillow is not only about material culture, it is also about repetition. Human beings are highly responsive to repeated conditions. The body learns patterns, and sleep is one of the most patterned behaviors in life. If a person sleeps in the same general environment for years, the environment begins to feel less like an external setting and more like part of the resting process itself. The pillow, once established within that routine, can become woven into the body's expectations. Looking back toward the much earlier human past makes this contrast easier to see. For most of human history, sleep was not organized around such stable repetition of objects. The ground differed, temperatures shifted, surfaces varied, bodies slept near fire, near others, or on materials that changed from night to night. Under those conditions, flexibility mattered more than precise expectation. The body adapted because it had to. But when sleep became more settled, more domestic, and more materially structured, the body could begin to rely less on adaptation and more on consistency. That consistency gave rise to habit. And once habit becomes strong enough, it can appear natural, even when it is historically recent. This may be one reason modern people often experience the pillow as something obvious or indispensable. The feeling is real, but the history behind it is much shorter than the history of sleeping without one. The body has not forgotten how old the ground is, but it has grown used to something newer. From this perspective, the pillow represents a shift from environmental response to learned expectation. It changes not only how the head is positioned, but how sleep is imagined. Rest begins to seem incomplete without a familiar object, even though for most humans who ever lived, that object was absent. The long human night once depended on posture, surface, warmth, and adaptation. Later, in more controlled worlds, it could also depend on habit. And habit, once formed deeply enough, can feel as ancient as the body itself, even when it is only a late chapter in the much longer history of human sleep. As this repeated arrangement continued across generations, the role of the pillow began to shift further, moving from something that could be used to something that quietly shaped how sleep was organized in the mind. The body does not only respond to physical conditions, it also responds to patterns that are encountered again and again. When the same sequence repeats each night, a flat surface, a familiar space, a consistent height beneath the head, the body begins to recognize this sequence as part of the transition into rest. Over time, this recognition can become so stable that it feels inseparable from sleep itself. The head comes to expect a certain angle, the neck comes to expect a certain degree of elevation. The moment of lying down becomes linked not only to posture, but to the presence of a specific object in a specific place. This does not mean that the body has lost its underlying flexibility. It means that flexibility is used less often, because the environment no longer requires it in the same way. In earlier human settings, the body had to solve the problem of rest each night through adaptation. In more stable environments, the solution could be prepared in advance. The pillow becomes part of that preparation. It reduces the need for adjustment by offering a ready-made position for the head. In doing so, it also narrows the range of positions that are regularly used. The body begins to rely on a smaller set of familiar arrangements, and these arrangements become reinforced through repetition. Looking back toward the long, earlier history of human sleep, this narrowing stands in contrast to a much wider range of possible postures. When the ground was uneven, when materials varied, and when sleep occurred in changing conditions, the body could not depend on one fixed angle or one stable support. It had to remain capable of shifting. The head followed those shifts, moving with the shoulders and torso as needed. In that older pattern, variation was normal. In the newer pattern, variation may still occur, but it is often contained within a smaller range. The pillow helps define that range by setting a consistent reference point beneath the head. This change may also influence how discomfort is experienced. When the body is used to adjusting, it may respond to slight discomfort by shifting position. When the body is used to a fixed support, it may instead notice the absence of that support more immediately. The feeling of needing a pillow can therefore be understood not only as a response to physical strain, but also as a response to the interruption of a learned pattern. The expectation itself becomes part of the experience. This does not make the pillow unnecessary in modern life. It means that its importance is partly shaped by habit as well as by function. The body has learned to rest in a certain way, and that learning has taken place over relatively recent periods compared to the much longer span of human history without such objects. Across that longer span, sleep was not built around a single, consistent arrangement repeated every night. It was built around adaptation, variation, and the ability to find rest under different conditions. The introduction of the pillow changes that relationship. It introduces consistency where there was once variability. It introduces a fixed point where there was once a range. And over time, that fixed point becomes familiar enough that it can feel essential. From this perspective, the history of the pillow is not simply a story of added comfort. It is a story of how repeated environments shape the body's expectations, gradually transforming something that was once optional into something that feels necessary, even though the deeper history of human sleep tells a much longer story of rest without it. As this pattern continued across longer stretches of time, the boundary between what the body needed and what it had learned to expect became less clear. The pillow, once an addition within certain environments, could begin to feel like a natural part of sleep itself. This is how habits often work. They do not announce themselves as recent changes. They settle quietly into repetition until they seem inseparable from the behavior they accompany. In the case of sleep, this effect can be especially strong because sleep happens every day and under similar conditions. The more consistent the environment becomes, the more consistent the body's expectations become as well. A familiar height beneath the head, a familiar angle of the neck, a familiar sense of support when lying down. These begin to form a pattern that the body recognizes as part of rest. Over time, the absence of that pattern can feel like a disruption, even if the body still retains the underlying ability to adapt. Looking back toward the much earlier human world, this shift stands out clearly. For most of human history, Sleep did not depend on repeating the same arrangement night after night. It depended on the ability to find a workable arrangement within changing conditions. The ground was not identical. The materials available were not identical. The temperature, the presence of others, and the influence of fire could all vary. Under those conditions, the body did not rely on a single fixed reference point beneath the head. It relied on flexibility, on posture, and on small adjustments that allowed rest to continue even as conditions changed. The introduction of the pillow changes this relationship in a quiet but important way. It reduces the need for ongoing adjustment by providing a stable point beneath the head. This stability can be useful, especially in environments where the rest of the sleeping surface is already stable. But it also shifts part of the responsibility for comfort away from the body and onto the object. The head is no longer required to find its position entirely through the alignment of the shoulders and spine. It can rely on the pillow to hold a chosen angle. Over time, this reliance can become part of the body's routine. The muscles may relax more quickly when the familiar support is present. The transition into sleep may feel smoother when the expected arrangement is in place. These effects are real, but they are also shaped by repetition. They reflect a body that has adapted to a new pattern, just as earlier bodies adapted to older ones. This perspective helps bring the long history of sleeping without pillows into clearer view. It suggests that what feels necessary today may not have been necessary across most of human time. It also suggests that the body's capacity to rest is broader than any single arrangement. The pillow is one way of organizing sleep, but it is not the only way that has existed. For much of human history, sleep was achieved without that specific support, through a system that depended more on adaptation than on fixed objects. As the modern pattern becomes more familiar, it can be easy to forget that earlier system. Yet the body still carries traces of it in the way it can shift position, adjust posture, and find rest even when conditions are not perfectly arranged. In this sense, the pillow represents a learned stability layered on top of an older flexibility. It changes how sleep is experienced, but it does not erase the deeper capacity that came before it. And that capacity, shaped over long stretches of time close to the origin of human life, remains part of the body even now, quietly reminding us that the history of sleep is longer and more varied than the habits we have come to expect. In the modern world, the environment of sleep has become more controlled than at any other point in human history. Surfaces are flattened and stabilized, temperatures are adjusted through enclosed spaces, light is reduced or managed. Materials are chosen for softness, consistency, and predictability. Within this environment, the act of lying down no longer requires the same degree of negotiation with the ground, with temperature, or with shifting surroundings that once shaped human rest. The bed itself becomes a prepared space, and within that space, the pillow takes on a defined and expected role. It lifts the head to a chosen height, maintains a familiar angle for the neck, and creates a consistent starting position for sleep. When this arrangement is repeated night after night, it can begin to feel as though it reflects something inherent in the body, rather than something created by the environment. Yet when this modern arrangement is viewed alongside the much longer span of human history, a different picture appears. For most of that history, sleep did not take place on uniformly flat, elevated surfaces. It happened on ground that could vary in firmness, slope, and texture, often changing from one night to the next. The body responded to that variation by adjusting posture, shifting position, and distributing weight across multiple contact points. The head remained part of that system, moving with the shoulders and spine rather than being fixed at a predetermined height. In contrast, the modern bed reduces variation. It presents a surface that behaves in similar ways each night, allowing the body to settle more quickly into familiar positions. The pillow, within this system, reinforces that consistency by stabilizing the position of the head. This combination of stable surface and stable support changes how the body experiences rest. It reduces the need for continuous adjustment and replaces it with a more predictable arrangement. This predictability can be beneficial in many ways, especially in environments where other aspects of life are also structured and repetitive. However, it also narrows the range of positions that are commonly used. The body becomes accustomed to a smaller set of postures, and the head becomes associated with a particular height and orientation. When that arrangement is absent, the difference can feel more noticeable, even if the body retains the capacity to adapt. Looking back toward the early human world, Close to the beginning of our species and through the long periods before controlled interiors became common, this contrast becomes more pronounced. Sleep once occurred within environments that were less stable and more variable. The body had to remain responsive, and that responsiveness extended to the position of the head. There was no single, repeated arrangement that defined rest. Instead, rest emerged from the interaction between body and environment, shaped by conditions that could shift from night to night. The modern sleeping environment changes that interaction. It introduces a level of consistency that reduces the need for adaptation. The pillow becomes part of that consistency, helping to maintain a fixed relationship between the head and the rest of the body. Over time, this arrangement can feel natural, even though it represents a relatively recent development in the broader history of human sleep. This does not mean that modern sleep is less valid or less effective. It means that it is organized differently, relying more on stable external conditions than on internal flexibility. The body, in turn, adapts to that stability, learning to rest within a narrower range of positions and expectations. From this perspective, the question of why humans did not use pillows for most of their history leads to a broader understanding of how sleep itself has changed. The absence of pillows was part of a larger pattern in which the environment remained variable and the body remained adaptable. The presence of pillows today reflects a different pattern, one in which the environment is stabilized, and the body learns to depend on that stability. Both patterns can support rest, but they do so in different ways, and recognizing that difference helps place the modern experience of sleep within the much longer and more varied story of how humans have rested across time. As the modern sleeping environment becomes more refined, it also becomes more specific in how it shapes the body's experience of rest. The bed is no longer just a place to lie down. It is designed to behave in a predictable way, with materials chosen to respond consistently to weight and movement. The pillow, placed within this system, adds another layer of precision. It defines not only where the head rests, but how it rests, creating a stable relationship between the neck and the surface below. This stability can make the transition into sleep feel smoother, because fewer adjustments are required once the body lies down. The shoulders settle into a familiar depth. The spine follows a familiar curve. The head meets a familiar level. Over time, this repeated alignment can become closely associated with the feeling of rest itself. Yet this refinement also changes the role of the body in the process of sleep. When the environment provides a stable arrangement, the body does not need to adjust as much. The small movements that once helped distribute pressure and respond to changing conditions may become less frequent or less pronounced. The head, supported by a pillow, is less free to move in relation to the rest of the body. Its position is partly determined in advance, and while movement still occurs during sleep, it often happens within a narrower range defined by the shape and placement of the pillow. Looking back toward the long earlier history of human sleep, this narrowing of movement stands in contrast to a more flexible pattern. When surfaces varied and conditions changed, the body remained active even in rest, making small corrections to maintain comfort. The head moved with those corrections, not independently, but as part of the same system. There was no single point beneath it that held it in place. Instead, its position emerged from the shifting relationship between shoulders, spine, and ground. In the modern setting, that relationship is partly replaced by a fixed support. The pillow carries some of the responsibility that once belonged to posture. This shift may influence not only how the body rests, but how it responds when the familiar arrangement is altered. When a person accustomed to a consistent pillow lies down without one, the difference can feel immediate. The head may seem lower than expected. The neck may notice the change in angle more sharply. The body may begin to search for a familiar alignment that is no longer provided externally. Yet if given time, the body often begins to adjust, rediscovering ways of distributing support through posture. This response suggests that the underlying capacity for adaptation has not disappeared. It has simply been used less often within a more controlled environment. From a broader perspective, this reveals an important aspect of human sleep. It is not fixed to one arrangement. It can function within different systems, provided those systems are consistent enough for the body to adapt to them. In the past, the system was built around variation, and the body adapted through flexibility. In the present, the system is built around stability, and the body adapts through expectation. The pillow, within this modern system, becomes part of a larger structure that defines how sleep is organized. It is not only a tool for comfort, it is a reference point that helps maintain a particular form of rest. This does not diminish its usefulness, but it does place it within a historical context. The need for a pillow is not simply a reflection of how the body is built. It is also a reflection of how the sleeping environment has been shaped. When that environment changes, the experience of rest changes with it. Looking back toward the earlier human world, near the long origin of our species, reminds us that sleep once depended more on the body's ability to respond than on the environment's ability to provide. The modern arrangement reverses that balance. It offers stability first and the body follows. In doing so, it creates a form of rest that feels natural within its own context, even though it differs from the much longer pattern in which humans slept without raising the head on a separate object at all. As the modern pattern of sleep becomes more established, it can begin to shape not only the body's expectations, but also how people understand what sleep is supposed to feel like. A stable bed, a consistent surface, and a familiar pillow create a kind of reference frame. Within that frame, comfort is often defined by how closely the body matches a known arrangement. If the head is raised to the expected height and the neck rests at a familiar angle, the experience may be described as correct or comfortable. If that arrangement changes, even slightly, the difference may be noticed immediately. This way of interpreting sleep is subtle, but it reflects a shift from an older pattern. In earlier human settings, where the environment was less controlled and surfaces were less uniform, comfort may have been understood differently. It may have been less about achieving a single correct position and more about maintaining a state in which the body could continue to rest without persistent discomfort. That state could include small movements, gradual adjustments, and a range of acceptable postures. The head, in that system, did not need to meet a precise standard. It needed to remain part of a stable overall arrangement that could change as conditions changed. Looking back toward the deep past, close to the origin of our species and through the long stretches of time that followed, this difference in interpretation becomes important. The body that once slept on variable ground, near fire, within groups, and across shifting temperatures, was not guided by a fixed idea of how sleep should look or feel. It responded to immediate conditions and adjusted as needed. The absence of a pillow did not create a constant sense of lack, because there was no expectation that the head should be elevated in the first place. In the modern environment, where conditions are more stable and repeatable, expectations become more defined. The pillow becomes part of that definition. It helps create a consistent experience that can be recognized and repeated. Over time, this consistency can make alternative arrangements feel unfamiliar, even if they are not inherently unworkable. The body may initially resist change, not because it cannot adapt, but because it has learned to associate rest with a specific set of conditions. This does not mean that modern sleep is less valid or less effective. It means that it is shaped by a different balance between body and environment. The environment provides a stable structure, and the body aligns itself within that structure. In earlier human history, the balance was different. The environment was less stable, and the body provided more of the adjustment. The head remained close to the ground not because it had to, but because the system of sleep did not yet separate it from the rest of the body. From this perspective, the long absence of pillows is easier to understand. It reflects a form of rest that did not depend on precise external supports or fixed expectations. It was grounded in variability, in adaptation, and in the ability to maintain comfort across a range of conditions rather than within a single ideal arrangement. As sleep environments changed over time, becoming more controlled and more consistent, the meaning of comfort changed with them. The pillow became one expression of that change, helping to define a new standard of rest. Yet beneath that newer standard, the older capacity remains. The body can still adjust, still shift, and still find rest even when familiar supports are absent. This suggests that the history of human sleep is not a simple progression from discomfort to comfort, but a transition between different systems, each with its own logic. The modern system feels natural because it is repeated. The older system feels distant because it is no longer common. But both belong to the same long story, in which the human body has always found ways to rest, whether the head was raised above the ground or resting close to it. As we come closer to the end of this long path through human sleep, it becomes possible to see the question from a wider distance. For most of human history, the absence of a pillow was not experienced as something missing. It was simply part of how rest was arranged. The body lay down within a world that was not shaped to fit it perfectly, and so it learned to fit itself to that world instead. The ground remained the primary surface. Materials, when available, softened or insulated that surface but did not divide it into separate zones of support. The head remained close to the body, moving with it, responding to the same forces of gravity, temperature, and space. Sleep was not built around a single object placed beneath one part of the body. It was built around a relationship between body and environment that allowed rest to emerge through balance and adjustment. Over many thousands of generations, this relationship repeated itself across different landscapes, climates, and social arrangements. People slept near fire, where warmth shifted and smoke moved. They slept near one another, where proximity changed how heat was shared and how posture formed. They slept on surfaces that varied from night to night, requiring the body to remain responsive rather than fixed. Within all of these conditions, the head did not need to be lifted away from the ground to make sleep possible. It remained part of a larger system in which stability came from distribution rather than from a single point of support. When pillows eventually appeared, they did not replace a broken system. They introduced a different one. They shifted part of the responsibility for alignment and comfort from the body to the environment. They created a consistent reference point beneath the head, reducing the need for constant adjustment. In doing so, they also narrowed the range of positions that were regularly used, guiding the body toward a more fixed arrangement. Over time, this arrangement became familiar, and familiarity became expectation. The presence of a pillow began to feel natural, even though it represented a relatively recent change in the long history of human rest. Looking back toward the beginning of our species, this contrast becomes a quiet reminder. The body that exists today is not entirely separate from the body that slept on the ground, adjusted to uneven surfaces, and rested without specialized support for the head. The underlying structures remain. The capacity to adapt remains. What has changed is the environment in which that body now rests, and the habits that have formed within that environment. This does not require a rejection of modern sleep. It simply invites a broader understanding. The pillow is not a universal starting point. It is one of many ways in which humans have organized rest. Before it, there was a much longer period in which sleep was achieved without lifting the head onto a separate object, through a system that relied on posture, surface, warmth, and shared space. That system did not vanish. It became less visible as new patterns took its place, yet it remains part of the body's history, a quiet background to the habits of the present. From this perspective, the question is no longer only about what humans used or did not use. It becomes a reflection on how sleep itself has changed, and on how easily a repeated arrangement can come to feel essential. If most humans once rested without raising their heads above the ground, and if the body still carries the ability to adapt within different conditions, then the modern experience of needing a pillow may not be a fixed requirement, but a learned one. And if that is so, then the deeper question remains open, resting quietly at the edge of this long history. What does the body remember about sleep, beneath the habits it has learned, and what would it feel like to rest again in the older way that shaped most of human time? The long history of sleeping without a pillow does not ask us to admire the past or to distrust the present. It asks for something quieter than that. It asks us to notice how easily the familiar can begin to look timeless. A pillow feels ordinary now because it belongs to a larger modern world of repeated surfaces, stable interiors, controlled temperatures, and carefully arranged routines. Within that world, the head has been given its own place. The neck has been given its own angle. Sleep has been reorganized around consistency, and the body has adapted to that consistency so thoroughly that it can seem older than it is. But the longer human story tells us something more spacious. For most humans who ever lived, rest did not begin with a shaped object beneath the head. It began with the ground, with gathered plant matter, with hides, with changing temperatures, with fire, with shared sleeping space, and with a body that could keep adjusting until stillness became possible. That older pattern lasted not for a brief chapter, but for the overwhelming majority of human time. This matters because it changes the meaning of the title itself. To say that most of human history never used a pillow is not simply to point out the absence of an object. It is to describe an entire way of sleeping, and perhaps an entire way of being in the world. The body was closer to the earth. The surface of rest was broader and less specialized. The head was not treated as something separate from the rest of the body's relationship to gravity, warmth, and terrain. Sleep emerged from a whole system rather than from a single device. When later societies began to create headrests and eventually softer pillows, they were not discovering the first true form of sleep. They were reorganizing an older one. That reorganization was real and meaningful, but it was also local, gradual, and shaped by changing living spaces rather than by a sudden discovery that the body had always needed elevation beneath the head. Looking back in this way can be gently educational, because it reminds us that many things that feel basic in the present are actually built from habit, material culture, and repetition. Human beings often inherit arrangements long enough that they begin to experience them as nature. Yet history keeps showing that the line between nature and habit is rarely simple. The body adapts to what it does often. It becomes skillful in the conditions it repeats. For most of human time, the repeated condition was not a pillow but the earth and whatever could be laid upon it. In the present, the repeated condition may be a bed, a pillow, a room kept at one temperature, and a sleeping posture that returns each night with little variation. Both worlds shape the body, but they do not shape it in the same way. This broader view also protects the central idea from becoming too absolute. It would be too simple to say that pillows are unnatural, or that sleeping without them is somehow more authentic. The deeper truth is more careful than that. Human sleep has always been flexible, and human living conditions have always influenced how that flexibility is expressed. Pillows are part of that history too, but they are a late part, not the foundation. Their existence tells us more about the transformation of human environments than about an ancient universal requirement of the body. And perhaps that is the quiet value of the question. It invites us to see that rest, one of the most intimate parts of life, also has a history. It has changed with fire, with shelter, with materials, with social life, and with habit. The body we carry tonight is ancient, but the sleeping world around it is much newer. If there is a final lesson in this long history, it may be this. Human beings are shaped not only by what their bodies are, but by what their bodies repeat. For most of human history, sleep repeated itself close to the earth. The surface was broad, simple, and often imperfect. The body did not wait for the world to become comfortable in a modern sense. It learned how to settle within the world that existed. The head rested as part of the whole body's arrangement. The neck found its angle through posture, not through a separate object placed beneath it. Warmth was managed through closeness, through fire, through curling inward or opening outward. Rest was shared with surfaces, with weather, with darkness, and often with other people. In that older world, the absence of a pillow was not a sign of failure or lack. It was part of a larger human ability to adapt. That ability may be one of the quiet strengths hidden inside the history of sleep. It reminds us that the body is older than many of the objects that now seem essential to it. It also reminds us that comfort is never only physical. Comfort is partly biological, but it is also historical. It grows out of repeated surroundings. It becomes familiar through habit, and once it becomes familiar enough, it can begin to feel permanent, even when it is only the newest layer laid over a much older way of living. The pillow belongs to that newer layer. It is real, useful, and meaningful within the modern sleep environment. But it is not the beginning of the human story of rest. That story began much earlier, in a world where the body had fewer specialized supports and more direct contact with the conditions around it. To remember that is not to romanticize hardship. It is to see more clearly how flexible human life has always been. We often imagine progress as the replacement of discomfort with comfort, of crude living with refined living. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes history shows something more subtle. It shows that the body can thrive under arrangements very different from the ones it knows now, and that what feels necessary in one age may have been optional in another. That thought has educational value because it makes us more careful with our assumptions. It teaches us not to mistake familiarity for universality. It teaches us that even ordinary things, like the height of the head during sleep, can reveal a larger truth about how human beings slowly reorganize their lives. Over time, We build environments that shape our habits, and then those habits begin to shape what we believe the body has always needed. Yet beneath those habits, the older body remains. The same species that now rests in controlled rooms once slept near fire, on ground, on gathered plant matter, and under conditions that changed from night to night. The same spine, the same neck, the same shoulders belong to people who found sleep without raising the head on a separate cushion. That does not tell us to live as they did. It tells us something gentler and perhaps more useful. It tells us that the human body carries a long memory of adaptation, and that many of the comforts of the present are not eternal truths, but recent arrangements layered over ancient capacities. So the value of this question may lie not in whether a pillow is good or bad, natural or unnatural. Its value may lie in the humility it creates. A small object beside the head can open a much larger view of what human life has been, how quietly habits become necessities, and how much of our present rests on worlds that came very late. And when night returns, and the head lowers once again toward whatever surface waits beneath it, perhaps the oldest question is still the calmest one. Beneath all the comforts we have learned, what kind of sleep does the human body still remember?